All right, so we are going to be picking up in Matthew chapter 23 tonight, and then covering as much of chapter 24 as well that we have time for. But in Matthew chapter 23, um, we we see Jesus go from addressing the Pharisees occasionally, sort of as they come to him and test him, to he just unloads on them and their hypocrisy. And so this is just a very straightforward, very truth-filled exchange. And um, and the one really cool thing about this what Jesus says here is it really gives us a window into his character. So let's just get right into it. Then Jesus spoke to the crowds and to his disciples, saying, "The scribes and the Pharisees have seated themselves in the chair of Moses. Therefore, all that they tell you, do and observe, but do not do according to their deeds. For they say things and do not do them. They tie up heavy burdens and lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves are unwilling to move them with so much as a finger. But they do all their deeds to be noticed by men, for they broaden their phylacteries and lengthen the tassels of their garments. They love the place of honor at banquets and the chief seats in the synagogues, and respectful greetings in the marketplaces, and being called rabbi by men. But do not be called rabbi, for one is your teacher, and you are all brothers. Do not call anyone on earth your father, for one is your father, he who is in heaven. Do not be called leaders, for one is your leader, that is Christ. But the greatest among you shall be your servant. Whoever exalts himself shall be humbled, and whoever humbles himself shall be exalted." Um, and so Jesus, uh, Jesus here begins to pronounce um, uh, truth, what are called eight woes upon the Pharisees. Well, that's actually he's introducing the eight woes that they're going to happen in the next passage, but he's introducing sort of here are the things that are wrong with the scribes and the Pharisees. In verse 2, he says that they've seated themselves in the chair of Moses. This is kind of interesting. Notice first off that they've seated themselves. This is a position um, that they have taken for themselves. It's not a position that God has given them. But the seat of Moses is, or the chair of Moses, is perhaps referring to a literal stone chair that would have been at the front of the synagogues. Um, the the synagogues themselves were sort of a recent development in Judaism in Jesus's day, um, where the faith went from being centered only at the temple with some Levites sort of spread around um, the different territory, the different tribes to teach. Um, well, somebody or some people had the idea that, hey, let's build these synagogues so that we'll have a place to teach the people in their own city regularly every Sabbath. And so they put a stone chair at the front of the synagogue, um, and this is probably what Jesus is speaking about here. The calling that the chair of Moses. The practice in that day was for the rabbi to sit down and for the people to stand up as they received the teaching. And so that having a chair in the front of the synagogue is a place of authority, a place of importance, and sitting in it says, "I am able to teach you the law," as sort of what they were doing by seating themselves in the chair of Moses. Um, and so verse 3, Jesus says, "Therefore, all that they tell you to do, all that they tell you, do and observe, but do not do according to their deeds. For they say things and do not do them. This is one aspect of hypocrisy, right? To teach things and not observe them, to have one standard, one standard for everybody else, one standard for themselves. And in fact, he goes on to say, verse 4, they tie up heavy burdens and lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves are unwilling to move them with so much as a finger. And so they saw all the rules and traditions that they piled on top of the law as something for other people, something to make life more inconvenient for other people. But somehow the traditions always made life easier and more convenient for themselves. Um, or else they served to bring honor and glory to themselves. What's interesting is that Jesus was the exact opposite of the Pharisees. Jesus, in contrast to the Pharisees, who laid burdens on other people, Jesus takes away our burden. We find even the teaching in Matthew chapter 11, starting in verse 28, Jesus um, Jesus says, come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I'm gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. And so the Pharisees gave people burdens. Jesus takes away our burdens. Going on to verse 5, chapter 23. But they do all their deeds to be noticed by men, for they broaden their phylacteries and lengthen the tassels on the garments. This is something that the phylacteries are sort of a uh, a way that the people sought to fulfill the law. We find it in Exodus 13, Deuteronomy 6. The idea is that he says, you shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontals on your forehead, speaking of the commandments. And so the Pharisees would literally take, and really many first century Jews would take commandments, written commandments, put them in a little leather box and tie it to their head. And that's what a phylactery is. Well, the Pharisees did that, but they made these like giant leather boxes. So people saw them walking around, they'd be like, "Whoa, what's that on your head?" Same thing with the tassels. The tassels were also part of the law. You guys remember what the tassels were the tassels on the edge of the garment, what are those supposed to remind the people of? It's supposed to be a reminder everywhere they went that they were to keep the commandments. It's a reminder of the law, to live by the law. And um, and so uh, the idea is it's supposed to be something small, but something that would be noticeable to the person who wears it as a reminder. You guys remember back in the 90s, everyone had those little bracelets that said, "What would Jesus do?" It's that kind of idea, right? But what did the Pharisees do? Well, they made these like giant tassels along the edge of their garment so that everyone else could see how righteous they were and how much they were reminded of the law. It came to be something not as a reminder for themselves, but a reminder for everyone else how righteous they were. Um, and Jesus, again, is the opposite of the self-importance of the Pharisees. Verse 6, we see they love honor at banquets, they love chief seats in the synagogue, they love respectful greetings, they love being called rabbi by men. But what did Jesus do? Well, he didn't even seek to glorify himself, although he was worthy of glory and is worthy of glory. Jesus' earthly ministry was done to glorify the Father. Um, In fact, even down to the title, we see the Pharisees wanted to be called rabbi and uh, teacher and father and so forth. Um, Now, of course, those titles are appropriate to Jesus, but what was his favorite title for himself?
Son of
Son of
Man.
Man, right? A very
Yeah.
humble title, even though it speaks to his divinity, if you read Daniel chapter 7. And yet, it's a very humble title, speaking of his identification with
Mhm.
his humanity. Um, and so, verse 11, but the greatest among you shall be your servant. Whoever exalts himself shall be humbled. Whoever humbles himself shall be exalted. Um, And this is speaking so directly to the contrast between Jesus, who's truly great, and those of his generation who thought they were great. Jesus is the one who's the servant of all. He's the one who's truly humbled. Read Philippians, how he humbled himself in order to live among us. Nobody has ever humbled themselves like Jesus did. Um, and yet, he is the one who's greatest of all. Really, really stunning contrast here. So, verse 13, we get into the woes. But woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you shut off the kingdom of heaven from people, for you do not enter in yourselves, nor do you allow those who are entering to go in. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. Uh, Sorry, I lost my place. All right. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you devour widows' houses, and for a pretense you make long prayers. Therefore, you will receive the greater condemnation. Um, and so, these are the eight woes pronounced upon the scribes and the Pharisees, and this begins with um, these woes that they were not only not entering the kingdom of heaven, but they were trying to keep people out of it. They were opposing Jesus, trying to keep people from coming to Jesus. We see here also, verse 14, their greed that they would take even widows' houses. But then they'd go around and make these long prayers as if God is eager to hear the prayer of somebody who prays on another person. Um, Verse 15, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you travel around on sea and land to make one proselyte, and when he becomes one, you make him twice as much a son of hell as yourselves. And so the Jesus doesn't Jesus doesn't condemn this practice of the scribes and Pharisees to seek people out, to introduce them to God, to introduce them to the scriptures. But notice what they were doing. They were not trying to make converts in order to bring people close to God. Uh, they were trying to make people like themselves, followers of traditions, um, and not truly loving and knowing the Lord. To apply this to our day, we all know the importance of preaching the gospel, right? It's so important that people um, would hear that message, the message of life, the offer of new birth in Jesus Christ. But that being said, those who carry the message of the gospel must first be transformed by the gospel. Because what's likely to happen if somebody preaches the gospel without the power of God behind that preaching? Well, the people that they preach to are liable to um, follow in their example and live lives of mouthing the words of the gospel without truly believing it, understanding it, being transformed by the power of God. Verse 16, woe to you, blind guides, who say, whoever swears by this temple that is nothing, but whoever swears by the gold of the temple is obligated. You fools and blind men, what is more important, the gold or the temple that sanctified the gold? And whoever swears by the altar, that is nothing, but whoever swears by the offering on it, he is obligated. You blind men, which is more important, the offering or the altar that sanctifies the offering? Therefore, whoever swears by the altar swears by both the altar and by everything on it, and whoever swears by the temple swears both by the temple and by him who dwells within it. And whoever swears by heaven swears both by the throne of God and him who sits on it. Apparently, there were different kinds of teachings in Jesus' day that um, the Pharisees engaged in all this clever wordplay to try to avoid fulfilling their obligations. And so they would say, well, if you swear by the temple, that doesn't count as binding. But if you swear by the gold on the temple, then that is binding. And so you could trick somebody, right? If you said, I swear by the temple, you don't have to actually do the thing that you've promised. And Jesus says that is so untrue. And how flippant, how sacrilegious, how blasphemous to swear upon the place God said his throne would be on earth in the temple, and say that means nothing. Um, in fact, in the beginning of the Gospel of Matthew, Matthew chapter 5, verse 37, Jesus said, let your yes be yes and your no be no. In other words, be so honest. You don't have to go around, I swear this and swear that. People don't have to look at your words and say, oh, is he trying to trick me here or trick me there? Is he carefully parsing his words so he doesn't have to fulfill his obligations? Jesus says, no, just be honest. Just be honest. Let your yes be yes and your no be no. Verse 23. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you tithe mint and dill and cumin, and have neglected the weightier provisions of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. But these are the things you should have done without neglecting the others. You blind guides who strain out a gnat and swallow a camel. Um, and so he says that the Pharisees um, were very conscientious about the very smallest matters of the law, and yet neglected the weightier provisions. Um, that is to say, they had lost all sense of perspective. And so they were even tithing on out of their herb garden, right? They'd go out to gather herbs out of their herb garden, and they'd say, oh, here's a tenth. We have to give this part to the Lord. The rest of this we can use in our cooking. Um, and and yet he says they neglected the weightier provisions of the law. This is to say those parts of the law that have a greater impact or greater importance, the weightier matters. What are they? Justice and mercy and faithfulness. Justice and mercy and faithfulness. Um, this is, I'm sure Jesus is referencing here the prophet Micah, chapter 6, verse 8. He says, he has told you, O man, what is good and what does the Lord require of you, but to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. And so uh, the law, the law had a lot of commandments, had I think by some counting 613 commandments. And that's a lot. But and really nobody other than Jesus has perfectly fulfilled the commandments of the law because we have wicked hearts that rebel against God's commandments. But that being said, it's not very hard to understand the spirit of the law. And Jesus referencing Micah, distills it here down to 3 points. The weightier provisions of the law: justice, mercy, and faithfulness. Notice what he says, but these are the things you should have done without neglecting the others. So he says it's fine. It's fine for you to go out to your herb garden and tithe your herbs. Go for it. But you should have actually obeyed the commandments that have a greater impact by you breaking them. He says, you blind guides who strain out a gnat and swallow a camel. This is kind of a funny thing to imagine. But these are both unclean animals. You couldn't eat a gnat, you couldn't eat a camel. And apparently it was a practice of some of the very observant Pharisees of the first century to actually strain their water or their wine or whatever through some kind of cloth to make sure there weren't any gnats in there, that they wouldn't accidentally eat an unclean animal and become unclean themselves. And just a very conscientious kind of thing to do. But Jesus says they they are so blind to the weightier matters of the law that even while straining out a gnat, they would just gulp down an entire camel without noticing it. Verse uh, Verse 25, "What are you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites? For you clean the outside of the cup and of the dish, but inside they're full of robbery and self-indulgence. You blind Pharisee, first clean the inside of the cup and of the dish, so that the outside of it may become clean also. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you are like whitewashed tombs, which on the outside appear beautiful, but inside are full of dead men's bones and all uncleanness. So you too outwardly appear righteous to men, but inwardly you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness." And so Jesus speaks here to two illustrations of again the hypocrisy of the Pharisees. Here it's a hypocrisy that lives one way on the outside, but lives a different way in secret. And the first is the dish. That one's pretty easy to understand, the cup or the dish. And he says, you're like people who wash the outside of the cup or the dish. So it looks good to everybody else. But you're actually eating old rotten food along with your whatever else you put in that bowl or that cup. Second one is, he says, you're like whitewashed tombs, which on the outside appear beautiful, but inside they're full of dead men's bones and all uncleanness. Apparently, this was an actual practice in the first century that, especially around the time of Passover, they would paint the outside of the tombs white, and it was probably to just for aesthetic reasons, to make things beautiful, and maybe even an appreciation for the coming resurrection. But it also served as a warning to pilgrims coming to celebrate Passover, in that if they touched a tomb, in particular, if they touched a tomb accidentally without recognizing what it was, then they would become clean and they become unclean and couldn't celebrate the feast. And so the white paint on the outside would serve as a warning not to touch the tomb. And so Jesus says they're like those tombs which look good on the outside, but inside they're full of uncleanness. Verse 29, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you built the tombs of the prophets and adorn the monuments of the righteous, and say, if we had been living in the days of our fathers, we would not have been partners with them in shedding the blood of the prophets. So you testify against yourselves that you are sons of those who murdered the prophets. Fill up then the measure of guilt of your fathers. You serpents, you brood of vipers, how will you escape the sentence of hell? Therefore, behold, I am sending you prophets and wise men and scribes. Some of them you will kill and crucify, and some of them you will scourge in your synagogues and persecute from city to city, so that upon you may fall the guilt of all the righteous blood shed on earth, even from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. Truly I say, truly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. Um, and so uh, Jesus called out the scribes and Pharisees for their hypocrisy in honoring dead prophets from the past, martyred prophets from the past, because he knew what was coming. Um, Namely, he knew that they were going to kill him. He knew that they were going to kill his followers after him. And so uh, they were going around building these great monuments on top of the tombs of prophets from the past who'd been killed for speaking for the Lord. Um, because in every age, people do not like the conviction that the Word of God brings. They have never liked it in the past. We don't like it today. Unless we're transformed by the power of God, we are liable to kill off the messenger of God today, too. Um, and so let's not pat ourselves on the backs uh, if we are more hospitable to messengers of God today than the people were back then. It's not because of anything in ourselves. It's because we've been transformed by the power of God. Um, and so Jesus recognizes these very same men who uh, who patted themselves on the back, said, "We're so much better than those who've come before us, those who killed the prophets. We would never do such things." He knows that those very same men are going to kill him very soon and kill his followers in the following years. All right, verse 37. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together, the way a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you were unwilling. Behold, your house is going to be left to you desolate. For I say to you, from now on, you will not see me until you say, Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. So this is a lament over Jerusalem. Listen to the tender way Jesus describes the city that he loves. Um, how often I wanted to gather your children together the way a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you were unwilling. Um, and so, and he says, um, verse 38, behold, your house is being left to you desolate. Um, some 40 years after Jesus said this, the city of Jerusalem fell to the Romans in a horrific fashion. Verse 39, he says, For I say to you, from now on, you will not see me until you say, Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. This is from Psalm 118. Interesting thing about Psalm 118 is just a few verses before this part that he quotes is that famous line, the stone that the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone. And then the psalmist goes on to say, Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, speaking, of course, about Jesus, the anointed one. And also Jesus, the stone which the builders rejected, has also become the chief cornerstone. Um, speaking to his rejection at the hands of his own people, but his acceptance by God the Father. All right. Anyone have anything that the Lord spoke to you in chapter 23 before we go to the next chapter? All right, chapter 24. This is a chapter where Jesus speaks on the future things and including the end of the age, the end of the world. And there's a lot of controversy about this chapter. Definitely don't have time to cover every view on it tonight. So I'm gonna try to give you my view and a few points. I'll give you a few other major views as they touch on this chapter. But let's get right into it. So, Matthew chapter 24. Jesus came out from the temple and was going away when his disciples came up to point out the temple buildings to him. And he said to them, do you not see all these things? Truly I say to you, not one stone here will be left upon another, which will not be torn down. As he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, tell us, when will these things happen? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? All right, so we find Jesus leaving the temple. The translation I'm reading from New American Standard says he came out of the temple and was going away. Apparently, this is a very emphatic way to say that he was leaving. That is to say, like he was leaving never to return. It's a very emphatic. He was leaving the temple, and his disciples point out the temple buildings to him. Now, you got to understand something that was happening in the first century, and that is that Herod was building additions and renovations onto the temple complex. And the historians tell us that Herod's renovation was absolutely breathtaking, especially compared to the original Second Temple, which was built under very difficult circumstances of great poverty. Herod's renovations brought in huge stones, and it was evidently a very incredible sight. And so the disciples, perhaps having heard Jesus's lament about the city of Jerusalem, they say to him, hey, look at these buildings, look how great they are. And perhaps even trying to cheer Jesus up, say, hey, not everything's so bad. Look at this great temple renovation. And Jesus says, do you not see all these things? Truly I say to you, not one stone here will be left upon another, which will not be torn down. In AD 70, there was a great Jewish revolt against Roman rule, and General Titus, the Roman general, led an army into Jerusalem to fight them, to quell the uprising. And what some of the historians say is that one of the soldiers accidentally tossed a torch into the temple. And so instead of just directly conquering the people holed up in the temple and looting the gold and so forth, the temple burned down in a enormous blaze. And the people who were holed up inside the temple burned to death. The flames were said to be so hot that they actually melted much of the gold that was overlaying the wood and other surfaces in the temple, and it ran in between the stones. And so it said that in order to recover all the all the gold from between the stones, the Romans pried them apart stone from stone, so that not one stone was left standing upon another. And so when you go to the Temple Mount now, there is the Western Wall, which is really kind of a foundation wall. It's kind of a retaining wall. It's not actually it's not part of the temple proper. There's really nothing left of it. And so this was fulfilled some 40 years uh, after Jesus said this in really a horrific fashion. And so the disciples ask him this question, tell us, when will these things happen, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? And so there are actually a lot of parts to this question. There's two or three parts to this question. When will these things happen? And what will be the sign of your coming? And of the end of the age. And so very likely the disciples understood these things to be one event, but uh, there has been an enormous amount of ink spilled over the answers to this compound question, and exactly what the implications are for the future. Now, one view would say that almost everything that Jesus is going to say in the next verses were fulfilled in the year 70 with the fall of Jerusalem. And um, it's called a preterist view or partial preterist view. And there's a lot of people who hold to this view. I don't think it's accurate, and we'll get into which parts of what Jesus is saying I think have not been fulfilled yet. Could not have been fulfilled in the year 70. All right, so let's get into what Jesus answers them. Jesus answered and said to them, "See to it that no one misleads you, for many will come in my name, saying, 'I am the Christ,' and will mislead many. You will be hearing of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not frightened, for those things must take place, but that is not yet the end. For nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom, and in various places there will be famines and earthquakes. But all these things are merely the beginning of birth pangs. Then they will deliver you to tribulation and will kill you, and you will be hated by all nations because of my name. At that time, many will fall away and will betray one another and hate one another. Many false prophets will arise and will mislead many. Because lawlessness is increased, most people's love will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end, he will be saved. The gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all the nations, and then the end will come." All right, so uh, and so Jesus begins to answer them with a very important point. See to it that no one misleads you. That is to say that there will be uh, many attempts at deception, many attempts at religious and prophetic deception leading up to the end. But notice what he says about all of these signs that he gives here. He says, um, uh, in verse 8, but all these things are merely the beginning of birth pangs. That is to say that none of these things that he's saying here are actually signs of the end. He's saying these things are going to happen. They're going to be very awful to live through. It will seem like it's the end, but it's not. And so all these things, what are the things that are not the signs of the end? Well, there's the deception, there's war, there's Cold War or rumors of war, there's false messiahs, famines, earthquakes, empires rising and falling, persecution, apostasy, infighting in the church, false prophets, lawlessness, and dead religiosity. Those are all going to happen. I believe he's saying between the time of his ascension and the time of his return. And they're not signs of the end. They're merely the beginning of birth pangs. Um, and the idea of birth pangs is that they do not, when the birth pangs begin, they signify that the time of birth is coming, but they do not say that this is the sign that immediately the birth is going to happen. But they increase in severity and frequency as the birth nears. And so I believe that's what Jesus is speaking of in terms of birth pangs, that we will see these things happen. We'll see these things continue to increase in severity and intensity until he comes back. But we can't take any of these things as a sign that he is coming back within a given time frame. Now, the last one, he says, verse 14, the gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all the nations, and then the end will come. And so this word for nations is ethnos, probably speaks more to a people group than what we would think of as a nation. But this does seem to be something that will immediately precede the end. But the way I understand this, he doesn't seem to be holding this up as a sign that the end is about to come, because I don't think I think only God knows when every people group has been reached, because there are many sort of remote people groups who still have not been reached with the gospel of Jesus Christ. I do believe that once they are all reached, Christ will return. But I don't think, I think we can look to the fact that missionaries are going out every day, translating the Bible into new languages. These are definitely signs that the end is drawing nearer. And even the use of the internet to preach the gospel instantaneously from one end of the world to the other, definitely signs that the end is drawing nearer. But I think only the Lord knows when every people group has been reached. I don't think this is a sign of the end. Or an answer to the question, when will these things happen? I think we see the answer to that in the next verse. Verse 15, therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. Whoever is on the housetop must not go down to get the things out that are in his house. Whoever is in the field must not turn back to get his cloak. But woe to those who are pregnant and those who are nursing babies in those days. But pray that your flight will not be in the winter or on a Sabbath, for then there will be a great tribulation, such as has not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will. Unless those days had been cut short, no life would have been saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. Now, Jesus says that, which seems to me saying it emphatically, when you see the abomination of desolation, then here's what you must do. This seems to be the event that really frames a certain timing of everything. And in fact, that shouldn't be a surprise to us. Daniel speaks of the abomination that causes desolation in chapter 9 and chapter 11. And then in chapter 12, he says that from the time of the abomination that causes desolation until the end will be 1,290 days. This is somewhere around 3.5 years. And so this is speaking of, I believe, the time of the very midpoint of the Great Tribulation to the end, when Christ comes back as the conquering king, the glorious return of Christ. And so it's very clear from Daniel that when you see the abomination that causes desolation. If you're here to see it, you can start counting down the days. 1290 days later is the end. And so that seems to be the answer to when will these things be. Now, what is the abomination that causes desolation? Well, Daniel speaks of the abomination that causes desolation, and the prophecy of Daniel had an initial fulfillment in let's see, I think it was like the 3rd century BC, with the actions of Antiochus Epiphanes, who was a Greek king, and he he defiled the temple by sacrificing a pig in the holy place and setting up a statue of Zeus. And that was the abomination that caused desolation. It defiled the temple so that the sacrifices had to cease until it was cleansed. Now, this seems to have a future fulfillment. This is why I don't think that the things Jesus predicts here happened in 70 AD. And we understand from what Jesus is saying here that it's still future. He references Daniel the prophet, but he references the prophecy in Daniel as still being future from the time point of the 1st century. And so the reason I believe this is not speaking to the near future of 70 AD is because the temple burned before there could be any desecration carried out in the Holy of Holies. I believe the end times abomination that causes desolation is probably described in Revelation chapter 13, verse 14. And then it's actually the image of the beast, and that the Antichrist will force people to worship the image of the beast. And I believe he will probably set it up in the holy place in the temple, much as Antiochus Epiphanes did. All right, so Jesus speaks to this abomination that causes desolation as the sign. He's got a warning for anyone who is in the land and sees it happening, that they are to just get out of the city as quickly as they can. All right. Verse 23. Then if anyone says to you, behold, here is the Christ, or there he is, do not believe him. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and show great signs and wonders, so as to mislead, if possible, even the elect. Behold, I have told you in advance. So if they say to you, behold, he is in the wilderness, do not go out, or behold, he is in the inner rooms, do not believe them. For just as the lightning comes from the east and flashes even to the west, so will the coming of the Son of Man be. Wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. And so he says that there's going to be great deceptions, attempts to deceive during that time. And we see the descriptions of all the lying wonders that the Antichrist and the false prophet are able to perform, that trick a lot of people into believing that they are the Christ. And he says that there will be great signs and wonders, and that so as to mislead, if possible, even the elect. We're told in the book of Revelation there are a great many who come to Christ during the Great Tribulation, and apparently God preserves them in their faith and gives them a discernment to recognize that these wonders are are not from God. He also gives the warning in the book of Revelation, right? And in the Gospels, don't believe the lying signs. And so he warns them in verse 26, if they say to you, behold, he's in the wilderness, do not go out, or behold, he is in the inner rooms, do not believe them. For just as the lightning comes from the east and flashes even to the west, so will the coming of the Son of Man be. Wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. So the coming of the Son of Man is known as um, it's people use the Greek word parousia, which means coming, which is translated from to describe this event, the parousia, the coming of the Son of Man. And there's a lot of views on exactly how the timing of everything works out. I'll tell you how I see it. I may or may not be right. We'll find out when we get there. But the Bible speaks of the end times return of Jesus um, in sort of um, a few different aspects. And so, one way that we understand the end times return of Jesus is that he is going to come suddenly and catch his church up to be with him. And the other way we see the coming of Jesus is sort of a glorious return of Jesus as a conquering king. And so the way I would see it is that the catching up of the church or the rapture is happens before the Great Tribulation, and then the glorious return of Jesus happens at the end of the Great Tribulation when he uh, returns on a white horse with his saints behind him, and he comes to conquer those who oppose him. Um, and so I believe this is this glorious. Okay. So my view is that those two events are separated by 7 years. There's also a view that those happen almost at the same time. That the catching up of the church would happen at the end of the Great Tribulation, and Jesus catches us up, and then he brings us right back down to follow him on the horses. So that's those are kind of two views on that. Um, and so I see this speaking of the glorious return of Jesus to come as a conquering king. We see that verse 27, as lightning comes from the east and flashes even to the west, so will the coming of the Son of Man be. That is to say that Jesus's will return will sort of be a worldwide phenomenon. It will not be the kind of thing where you have to go out to the desert to seek him, or he's secretly somewhere. He's in the inner room and someone has to let us in. No, it will be very obvious, and he will return in glory. He says, verse 28, wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. I believe this is speaking to the fact that there will be a great battle. Jesus will be victorious. And as a result of the great slaughter of those who make war against Jesus, there will be a great many bodies on the face of the earth. And Ezekiel, in describing what I think is probably a different great end times battle in Ezekiel chapter 39, verse 17. He speaks of the same kind of imagery of God calling the birds to feast upon the dead bodies of people who have died in a great war. So kind of disgusting imagery, but I believe that's the same thing that he has in view here. All right, so I hate to I hate to cut this chapter in half, but we'll be here all night if we go all the way through to the end. So I think we're going to leave off at verse 31. All right. Um, so anyone have anything you'd like to share on these chapters? All right, awesome. Well, let's close in prayer. Father, thank you for your word, and just um, for the promise that you know the future, that you hold the future, though we may not have a perfect understanding of it. You've given us assurance of your good plan. And so, Lord, we trust you with it. Thank you. Just thank you for the great hope that we have to spend eternity with you. Praise in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.